The armies found one another upon the northern reaches of the Brimstone Peninsula, where the land rose from the shore in ragged shelves of black volcanic stone. There were few roads in that wasted country. Those that remained were little more than scars cut through ash, ancient paths once used by settlers, pilgrims, and prospectors before war had stripped the region of all gentler purpose. Broken walls protruded from the earth at odd angles. The foundations of abandoned settlements lay half-buried beneath drifts of gray dust. In the distance, narrow streams of lava moved through the deep fissures in the rock, their glow visible through the haze, like veins beneath diseased flesh. The air itself seemed hostile. Heat shimmered above the ground. Smoke gathered in shallow valleys and clung to the lower slopes. Every gust carried the smell of sulfur, old fire, and the metallic trace of blood spilled in battles long since forgotten. It was across this desolation that the Bloodbound came. They approached from the east beneath a sky stained red by the eternal fires of Aqshy. At their head marched an aspirant Deathbringer, broad of shoulder and encased in overlapping plates of dark iron. The armor had been hammered into brutal angles, each surface scored with cuts, notches, and the marks of weapons that had failed to kill him. A great axe rested across one shoulder. Its blade was broad enough to split a man from collar to hip, and its edge had been sharpened until it caught the distant light with a thin gleam of a predator's tooth. Behind him came the Blood Warriors. They advanced in a compact mass, their armor too heavy for silence. Iron boots struck stone. Chains rattled against breastplates. Blades scraped against shields and axe hafts. Each warrior was a moving fortress of brass, leather, and scarred flesh. Their helms shaped into snarling visages that concealed what little humanity remained beneath them. The Wrathmongers followed close behind. They came less as soldiers than a procession of living weapons. Barbed chains dragged through the ash. Flails swung from massive fists. Some laughed as they walked. Others muttered prayers to the blood god through broken teeth. Their presence worked upon the warriors ahead of them like a fever, feeding old grudges, sharpening hatred, and turning the promise of battle into an almost unbearable need. Along the peninsula's easternmost edge advanced the Skull Reapers. They kept apart from the other formations, 8 skulls each. That was the oath they had sworn. 8 worthy trophies before the sun descended through Aqshy's smoke. 8 lives taken and offered in Khorne's name. Anything less would be a failure. Anything beyond it would be tribute. Their demon-forged weapons moved restlessly in their hands. The metal appeared almost alive, dark surfaces twitching with reflections that did not belong to the landscape around them. The warriors carried hooks, cleavers, axes, and hooked blades designed less for battle than for the deliberate dismantling of bodies. Their armor, their weapons, and the stink of old slaughter proclaimed everything that needed to be known. They had come west in search of blood. Across the peninsula, the forces of the Cities of Sigmar prepared to deny them. An iron-welled great cannon occupied the western flank, its immense barrel angled across the broken ground. Crewmen moved around it with practiced urgency, driving stabilizing stakes into the earth and adjusting the carriage upon the uneven stone. Every motion had been rehearsed. Every tool had its place. Powder charges were stacked beneath heavy canvas. Iron shot rested in neat rows beside the wheels. The cannon stood as an expression of another kind of faith. It had no hunger and knew no rage. It required no blessing from God of murder. It existed to reduce men, monsters, and fortifications to the same scattered ruin. To the cannon's right marched the Steelhounds. They formed a bronze shield wall across the western approach, rank upon rank of soldiers in plate, leather, and the colors of their city. Their armor lacked the monstrous ornamentation of the Bloodbound, yet it carried a different weight. Every buckle, rivet, and polished edge represented a forge, a workshop, a quartermaster, a road maintained through hostile country, and a city stubborn enough to send its citizens into the wilderness. Behind them waited the grenadiers. They carried volatile charges in reinforced satchels and heavy gloves blackened from years of handling powder and alchemical compounds. They moved with the nervous precision of people well acquainted with the cost of carelessness. The alchemite warforger accompanied them, his equipment chiming softly as he walked. Glass vessels hung from his harness. Brass valves hissed. Coils of heated metal glowed beneath the plates of his apparatus. The air around him smelled of hot iron, oil, and unfamiliar regions. Further east, the Fusiliers took position behind their pavises. The heavy shields were planted into the earth one after another, forming a moving wall of timber and iron. Fusel cannons were raised across their upper edges. Slow matches smoldered. Gunners checked powder pans, adjusted rest, and studied the bloodbound formations through the wavering heat. Magister Ignatius Vaelor waited behind them upon his battle mount. He was impossible to mistake. Even among the elaborate uniforms, polished armor, and arcane instruments of the cities, Vaelor possessed the presence of a man accustomed to being watched. His robes were marked by the collegiate arcane, though travel and ash had dulled their splendor. Symbols of Aqshian magic had been worked into the fabric in thread that glimmered whenever he moved. One gloved hand rested upon the reins. The other remained near the focus through which he shaped his most destructive spells. The warriors of Khorne noticed him at once. To them, sorcery was an affront. Power drawn from gesture, word, and study was power stolen from the honest work of the axe. Vaelor's very presence offended the brutal creed by which the Bloodbound lived. He was marked before the first weapon was raised. His skull would be taken. His magic would be silenced. His body would be opened beneath Khorne's gaze. Near him stood the Aqshian pyromancer, robes stirring in the hot wind. The gallants gathered alongside, veterans and champions whose armor bore the scars of previous campaigns. They watched the eastern horizon and the armored shapes assembling beyond the smoke. Between the two hosts lay several points of strategic value. One was a raised crossing on the eastern front, where the ground narrowed between two deep fissures. Another stood westward among the ruined walls and shattered stone. A third occupied the center of the field, a low rise from which much of the northern peninsula could be observed. They were not grand places, yet armies were often destroyed over ground that appeared insignificant until the moment it was needed. The Bloodbound moved first. On the western front, the Slaughter Priest came forward among the Blood Reavers. He was tall, even among the warriors of Khorne, his body marked by ritual scars and old burns. Brass icons hung from his belt. Skulls knocked together as he walked. In both hands he carried the instrument of his office, a weapon made sacred through years of sacrifice. The Blood Reavers around him were poorly armored compared with the Blood Warriors to the east. Most wore little more than leather, scavenged metal, and thick bands of cloth wrapped around scarred limbs. What they lacked in protection, they carried in number, noise, and murderous anticipation. They struck axe hafts against shields. They shouted Vaelor's name without knowing anything of the man who bore it. They promised his skull to Khorne. The Slaughter Priest raised one hand. The clamor ceased. His gaze traveled across the warriors nearest him. For a few moments, none moved. Then he seized the first reaver. He spread his arms and threw back his head as the priest drove the blade into him. Blood poured over the weapon and steamed upon the heated ground. A second warrior was dragged forward. His death followed the first. The Slaughter Priest tore the blade free and held it above the gathered host. Blood ran down his arms in dark streams, disappearing beneath the cords and brass plates bound around his wrists. The reavers erupted. Their cries rolled across the western flank. Axes rose, bodies strained forward. The blood of their companions sanctified them. The slaughter priest began to chant words not spoken in any language of cities or scholars. They were harsh sounds, shaped in the throat, fragments of an older and more savage devotion. The blood at his feet moved as though disturbed by an unseen current. It crept through the ash in branching lines, winding around the boots of the surviving reavers. Their frenzy deepened. Eyes widened until the whites showed. Hands tightened around whipping grips. Some bit their own lips. Others hacked shallow wounds into their arms and smeared the blood across their faces. Every warrior seemed suddenly too large for his own skin, swollen with fury and desperate to tear open the first living thing that came within reach. The first offerings had been accepted. On the eastern front, the Deathbringer lowered his axe. The advance began. He ran toward the narrow crossing, iron plates hammering against one another with each stride. The Blood Warriors followed. Their heavy armor slowed them, yet none allowed the distance between themselves and their commander to widen. They crossed the black ground like a moving wall, boots crushing loose stone and abandoned debris beneath them. The Wrathmongers surged behind, chains whipping through the smoke. The Skull Reapers angled farther east, using the rough edge of the peninsula to conceal part of their advance. They moved without haste, conserving their strength, each warrior measuring the distance to the Sigmarite line and the skulls waiting there. In the west, the Slaughter Priest drove his Blood Reavers toward the ruined crossing. They claimed it in a red tide. A second unit of Blood Reavers followed behind the priest formation, filling the approach and spreading through the broken terrain. Then another figure separated himself from the host. The Red Raider ran alone. He was a champion only by the rough standards of the Blood Reavers, where authority belonged to whoever could kill most effectively and survive the challenges of those beneath him. His armor was little better than that of the warriors he left behind. A collection of trophies hung from his belt, among them the dark and shriveled remains of a heart taken from some forgotten victim. He carried his axe as though it were already wet. The Red Raider did not follow the Slaughter Priest toward the western crossing. He did not seek the protection of the Blood Warriors. He chose the center. He charged up the open ground by himself, boots striking sparks from the stone. Smoke moved across him and swallowed him for several heartbeats before he emerged again, farther ahead than any other warrior in the Bloodbound host. Behind him, the Slaughter Priest did not call him back. Ambition required witnesses, and failure required examples. By the time the first advance slowed, the Bloodbound held 3 approaches into the peninsula's interior. For a moment, the army of Sigmar remained motionless. Then, the great cannon spoke. The crew had selected the Western Blood Reavers. Orders passed down the line. The barrel shifted by degrees. A charge was rammed home. An iron ball followed. The crew withdrew behind the wheels as the gunner lowered the match. The explosion struck the peninsula like a thunderclap, with the weight of Sigmar's hammer. Fire burst from the cannon's mouth. Smoke enveloped the emplacement. The weapon recoiled hard enough to drive its carriage deeper into the earth. Across the field, the shot hit the Blood Reavers. 3 warriors vanished into a cloud of pulverized stone, flesh, and iron fragments. One was struck squarely and ceased to resemble anything that had once lived. Another was torn apart by debris. The third fell without his lower body, hands clawing at the ash before a nearby reaver stepped over him. The impact ripped a gap through the formation. Those nearest the dead staggered, ears rang, dust filled their mouths. The ordered surge toward the Sigmarite line became a confused mass of bodies moving around the crater. The Slaughter Priest roared at them to continue. Their rage remained, yet the cannon had stolen the momentum from their charge. The distance that had seemed conquerable moments earlier now stretched wide before them. On the eastern front, the Deathbringer attempted to close upon the enemy. He raised his axe and drove forward. The Blood Warriors followed, but the broken ground resisted them. Loose stone shifted beneath iron boots. Deep cracks forced the formation to divide and reform. The Deathbringer reached the edge of the crossing and found the Sigmarite line still beyond his reach. The Blood Warriors halted behind him. Their axes remained raised in fury unsatisfied. Yet the Bloodbound held the ground, and across 3 approaches the symbols of Khorne now stood closer to the peninsula's heart. The armies watched one another through smoke and heat. The silence that followed the cannon blast was brief. The Aqshian pyromancer stepped forward. He raised both hands and drew upon the fire sleeping beneath the land. The response was immediate. Flames burst from the cracks in the earth and spiraled upward. Ash swirled around the forming spell. The fire gathered into a skull larger than a man's torso, its jaw unhinged in a silent scream. Empty eye sockets burned white. Trails of flame streamed behind it as it moved toward the eastern flank. The manifestation crossed the battlefield like a burning omen. The Blood Warriors turned toward it. The Wrathmongers shouted in challenge. The Deathbringer stood beneath its approach, armor reflecting its light. From the western front, the Slaughter Priest sensed the sorcery. He turned away from the steel helms and thrust his gore-soaked weapon toward the apparition. His prayer tore across the battlefield. The flames surrounding the skull flickered. For an instant, the manifestation appeared to resist. Its jaws widened. Fire poured from its mouth and scorched the ground below. Then the skull collapsed. Its shape folded inward. The flames were dragged into the emptiness of its own eye sockets. What had been a roaring mass of Aqshian power became a shrinking knot of light, then sparks, then nothing. The Slaughter Priest lowered his weapon. The reavers around him howled. But the pyromancer's failure had not ended the assault of magic. Vaelor extended one hand toward the Deathbringer. The Magister's words were measured and exact, each syllable delivered with the calm of a scholar reciting a proven theorem. Symbols of fire formed in the air around his fingers. Lines of light crossed and joined until the spell hung before him like a sigil written upon the world. He closed his hand. The sigil ignited. Incandescent fire descended upon the Deathbringer. It did not spread outward like ordinary flame. It clung to him. It entered the joints of his armor and burned beneath the plates. Brass icons blackened. Leather straps curled. The air filled with the stink of scorched hide and flesh. The Deathbringer staggered. One knee struck the earth. For several seconds, he disappeared within the brilliance. When the flames receded, he rose again. Smoke poured from the seams of his armor. Blood ran down the armor. The skin visible beneath his helm had burned raw, yet he remained standing. The Blood Warriors struck their weapons against their shields. Their commander had endured the wizard's fire. The Alchemite Warforger began his own behind the western line. He moved along the rear flank of the steel helms, touching weapons with the head of a heated instrument. Each contact sent a pulse of alchemical energy through the metal. Spear points began to glow. Sword edges shone red. Thin vapors rose from the weapons as though the steel itself had developed a fever. The steel helms held formation. Whatever fear had entered them at the sight of the Blood Reavers was buried beneath discipline. Across the field, the Slaughter Priest watched them. He pointed. A prayer that followed began as a whisper. A soldier in the front rank stiffened as blood ran from beneath his nose. Another dropped his shield and clutched at his throat. A third stumbled into the man beside him. Then the blessing of Khorne took hold in full. Blood erupted from beneath their armor. It poured from mouths, eyes, and the gaps between plates. Bodies convulsed. Soldiers fell against one another, turning the shield wall into a collapsing tangle of iron and limbs. 6 steel helms died before the prayer ended. One remained standing for several seconds after the others had fallen, his weapon still raised, blood flowing freely from his helm. Then his knees gave way. The survivors closed ranks around the dead. Officers shouted, shields moved. The formation tightened as the steel hounds advanced. They crossed the western ground toward the Blood Reavers, stepping over the bodies of their own soldiers. Their purpose was clear. They would hold the Reavers away from the Grenadiers and the Warforger, even if the shield wall had to be rebuilt from corpses. Behind them, the Grenadiers entered the forest. Branches scraped against helmets and powder satchels. Smoke gathered beneath the trees. The soldiers moved carefully, using the trunks and tangled undergrowth to conceal their approach. The Alchemite Warforger broke from the formation and ran toward the center. His apparatus rattled. Glass vessels knocked together. Steam hissed from the valves at his back. He reached the central rise and climbed it alone, claiming the ground beneath the gaze of both armies. Farther west, the crew of the great cannon began to move their weapon. Levers were placed beneath the wheels. Men pushed at the carriage. The cannon advanced slowly up the flank, every yard won through sweat and shouted coordination. At last, the crew brought it onto higher ground beside an ancient place of power, where its barrel could be turned toward nearly any part of the field. On the eastern front, the Fusiliers moved toward the crossing claimed by the Deathbringer. Pavises were lifted and carried forward. Gunners advanced behind them. The line moved in short, deliberate stages, shield and weapon functioning as one. Ignatius Vaelor followed. His battle mount stepped carefully through the ash. Fire still flickered around the Magister's hand, and the symbols on his robes shone through the smoke. The gallants advanced beside the Fusiliers. They lowered their weapons. Ahead of them stood the Deathbringer and the Blood Warriors. The Red Raider saw the Warforger reach the central rise. He altered his course. The Blood Reaver champion recognized an isolated enemy and chose him. He turned toward the center and ran. The distance between the Red Raider and the Bloodbound host widened. The second unit of reavers remained far behind. The Slaughter Priest held the western crossing. The Deathbringer's regiment occupied the east. The champion continued alone. The Fusiliers stopped. Their pavises struck the ground. Fusil cannons rose across the shield line and aimed at the Deathbringer. The order was given. A ragged volley erupted. Smoke rolled over the Sigmarite formation. Shot struck the Bloodbound commander's armor with enough force to turn him sideways. One impact tore through an already weakened plate. Another struck near the shoulder and drove metal fragments into the flesh beneath. The Deathbringer stumbled. His axe struck the ground and held him upright. The Grenadiers fired from the forest. Their position was poor. Branches obscured the target and smoke disrupted their view. Several charges struck trees or burst harmlessly across the ground. Others found him. Explosions surrounded the Deathbringer. Earth and splintered stone hammered against his armor. Fire rolled over him for the second time. When the smoke cleared, he still stood at the crossing. His body bore the work of cannon, firearm, grenade, and spell. The great cannon turned towards the center. Its crew had seen the Red Raider. The lone Blood Reaver champion was close to the Warforger now, running down the exposed ground with his axe raised. The gun crew adjusted the barrel. The Red Raider continued to run. The gunner lowered the match and ignited the fuse. The cannon fired as shots screamed across the field too quickly for the eye to follow. It struck the Red Raider in full stride. A violent cloud of ash, blood, and shattered stone erupted where he had been. The force of the impact threw fragments across the central rise. Something dark struck the ground near the Warforger and rolled out of sight. The Blood Reavers on the western front saw the blast. Some raised their axes in approval. To die advancing alone beneath the fire of a great engine was no shame. The Red Raider had sought a worthy death and apparently found one. The Slaughter Priest turned his attention elsewhere. The Steel Helms charged the western Blood Reavers. Their formation moved as one, shields forward, alchemically heated weapons glowing between them. The distance closed rapidly. Then the line faltered. The broken ground beneath the ash gave way. A section of the formation was forced around a deep fissure. The ranks compressed, lost alignment, and slowed. They came close. So close that the foremost blood reavers could see their own distorted reflections in the steel-helmed shields. A fraction more ground would have brought the formations together. The charge failed. The steel helms halted in the open, separated from the frenzied reavers by little more than the length of a spear. The slaughter breeze smiled. On the eastern front, the gallants charged. They struck the bloodbound line with the force of disciplined cavalry and veteran steel. Weapons descended upon the blood warriors. Armor ranked beneath the impacts. Sparks burst. The gallants pressed hard, attempting to break the formation before the Deathbringer could recover from his wounds. The blood warriors endured. Blades scraped across brass. Axes caught spear shafts. Every blow that might have pierced flesh was turned aside by the heavy armor or the haft of a weapon. Not one blood warrior fell. Beside them, the Fusiliers drove into the eastern crossing. Their heavy shields crashed into the bloodbound formation. Gunners abandoned the careful discipline of the firing line and fought at close quarters, using reinforced stocks, short blades, and the weight of their pavises. For an instant, it appeared that the Sigmarite assault might force the blood warriors back. Then the Skull Reapers arrived. They came from the outer eastern flank at a run. No warning preceded them beyond the hammering of boots and the scrape of demon-forged metal across stone. They struck the exposed side of the Fusilier formation with weapons raised. The first blow split a pavis from top to bottom. The second removed the arm of the soldier behind it. Then the Skull Reapers entered the formation. What followed was not battle in any civilized understanding of the word. It was butchery, performed with practiced hands. Demon-forged blades punched through shields and breastplates. Hooked weapons dragged men from behind cover. Axes fell again and again, each impact accompanied by the wet rupture of flesh or the crack of bone. The Fusiliers attempted to turn. There was no room. Their own pavises trapped them. The shields that had protected them from arrows and shot became walls against which they were crushed. A Skull Reaper hooked one Fusilier beneath the ribs and lifted him from the ground. Another drove his axe through two men standing too close together. A third tore the helmet from a fallen soldier and removed the head beneath it with a second blow. A flurry of attacks fell upon the Sigmarite formation. Only one was turned aside. The rest broke through. The Fusiliers died where they stood. Some attempted to crawl beneath the pavises. Others reached for dropped weapons or tried to retreat through the men behind them. The Skull Reapers gave them no distance. Within moments, the firing line ceased to exist. Bodies lay piled behind the shields. Blood ran around the iron-shod bases and gathered in the cracks between stones. Smoke from the earlier volley still drifted above the position, obscuring the warriors responsible for the destruction. When the smoke thinned, the Skull Reapers stood alone. Their oath had begun to be fulfilled. The Blood Warriors surged against the gallants. They had absorbed the charge, now they answered it. Axes came down with brutal precision. Heavy blades found the seams beneath arms and along the neck. Some strikes did not need to pierce armor. The force alone drove metal inward and shattered the bodies beneath. 3 gallants fell. One was struck from the side and crushed beneath the boots of the advancing Blood Warriors. Another lost his weapon arm before an axe split his breastplate. The third died between 2 warriors, dragged down and hacked apart before he reached the ground. The surviving gallants held their position. They turned toward the Deathbringer. It came for them through the smoke. The Bloodbound commander moved with visible effort. His armor was burned black. Shot wounds bled beneath the plates. One arm hung lower than the other. Every step left a dark mark in the ash. Yet the Kingslayer axe remained in his hands. The gallants faced him. They had charged into the eastern crossing as soldiers of the Cities of Sigmar, veterans trusted to break the enemy line and clear the path for Vaelor's advance. They died beneath the axe. The Deathbringer's first strike shattered a guard and continued into the warrior behind it. The next blow cut through armor at the waist, followed by a third that landed upon a fallen body that no longer posed any threat. The Kingslayer axe rose and fell. Blood covered the Deathbringer's hands, his armor, and the ground around him. By the time the weapon lowered, the gallants had been destroyed so completely that no whole formation could be recognized among the remains. The eastern front fell silent. The Blood Warriors stood amid the dead. The Skull Reapers moved among the Fusiliers, selecting trophies and severing heads from bodies still trapped behind their shields. The Deathbringer remained upright at the center of the ruin, wounded almost beyond endurance, his axe wet and his armor smoking. Beyond him stood Ignatius Vaelor. The Magister had watched the Fusilier line disappear. He had seen the gallants swallowed by the Blood Warriors and cut down beneath the Deathbringer's axe. The disciplined eastern advance, built from shields, powder, steel, and arcane fire, had been shattered in the space of a few violent minutes. Only scorched ground separated Vaelor from the Bloodbound. The warriors of Khorne looked toward him. The fugitive remained alive. His skull remained unclaimed. On the western front, the battle had yet to begin in earnest. The surviving Steelhounds stood dangerously close to the Blood Reavers. Their formation had been weakened by the Slaughter Priest's prayer and stranded by the failed charge, yet their shields remained raised. The Grenadiers waited in the forest behind them. The great cannon occupied the high ground. The Alchemite Warforger stood alone upon the central rise, surrounded by smoke and fragments of stone thrown up by the cannon's last shot. Near him, something moved beneath the axe. The Red Raider had not died. The cannon had torn him from the battle and broken his charge, but rage clung to him more stubbornly than life had any right to. Beneath the smoke and debris, the Blood Reaver champion dragged himself through the dirt, one ruined hand closing around the haft of his axe. The armies had already counted him among the dead. For the moment, that suited him. Across the peninsula, the first clash came to an end. The Cities of Sigmar still held their cannon, their western line, and the central ground. Vaelor remained alive, thus the expedition had not broken. But the eastern advance had been annihilated. The Fusiliers were gone. The gallants were gone. The Deathbringer still stood. And among the Skull Reapers, the first of the day's promised trophies were already being raised from the dead. The Brimstone Peninsula had accepted its first offerings. It would demand many more.